Drug cheats, watch out. Sebastian Coe is coming to get you. The newly elected president of the IAAF vows zero tolerance in the battle against doping. But with a sport tainted by allegations against so many athletes, how can Coe and the IAAF clean its image? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Jane Dutton. Doping has long been a concealed reality in sport, in athletics, which has a history of high-profile doping scandals. Drug use was first banned in 1928, but some athletes have always tried to work around the ban. And in recent weeks, the sport has been blighted by allegations of widespread doping in track and field. Now, former Olympics champion Sebastian Coe has taken over as head of the International Association of Athletics Federations. He says he's determined to rid the sport of doping and has floated the idea of an independent drug testing system.
We do have to recognise that there is a too broad a view that this is something that, whether real or perceived, there are conflicts and there are loopholes, and I think an independent system is what we need to close down any thought that we're doing anything other than being entirely vigilant about that. There is a zero tolerance to the abuse of doping in my sport, and I will maintain that to the very highest level of vigilance. And that is something that clearly over the next week or two I will want to sit down and discuss with my colleagues.
Now, the use of performance-enhancing drugs date as far back as ancient Greece. Steroids are the drugs that often come to mind when we talk about doping, but athletes have been known to use everything from stimulants and hormones to cannabis and beta blockers. Part of the problem is new drugs are constantly being cooked up, some of which go unnoticed by doping experts. Among the most recent cases, 28 athletes who took part in the 2005 and 2007 World Championships and who have now been suspended, as well as allegations that the London Marathon has been won 7 times by runners with suspicious blood scores. Lots to discuss today then, so let's bring in our guest. Joining us from Nicosia is Stuart Page, the Director of International Policy and Governance Development. In London, John Goodbody, a sports reporter for the Sunday Times. And in Washington, D.C., Travis Waldron, a Huffington Post reporter who covers the politics of sports and culture. Welcome, all three of you. John Goodbody, what do you think about Sebastian Coe being the man? Can he do it?
Yes, I think he can. I think he's a man of great integrity. I've known him since the late 1970s. He has always been a very firm advocate against the use of doping in sport, and particularly in athletics, the sport in which he was twice Olympic 1500 metres champion. He's always had a strong view on this. He's a person of integrity. And I think he will do his level best in the months and years to come to do as well as he possibly can, as well as the IAAF can possibly can, to eradicate, well, not to eradicate, but because I think that would be almost impossible, but at least to cut down the number of doping cases that there are in international track and field athletics.
I mean, you say he's a man of integrity, and we certainly know what he did when it came to the Olympics, but is that enough? What other skills are needed to get to the bottom of what's going on at the moment?
I think his idea of having for athletics a independent body which is not directly associated with the IAAF, this would be similar to the organisation that the International Cycling Union, the UCI, themselves set up, whereby there is a separate organisation dealing with doping in track and field athletics, all within the umbrella, of course, of the World Anti-Doping Agency, which was set up originally in 1999, and then with the WADA code, which came in 2003.
Well, that seems to make sense, because I think for many people the IAAF can't be trusted at the moment. Stuart Page, do you think he can lead the IAAF to a better, cleaner, more transparent course?
Look, I think that he has a long way to go. He's only one person in the middle of a very large quagmire of governance problems. I mean, I do understand what John said, and I do think Sebastian Coe does have a lot of integrity. But one thing we have to look at is the IAAF have the testing and the sanctioning body. And he's right, there has to be an independent commission. He has a very hard job that has to happen first. He has to have internal reform of the IAAF. There's been a lot of, we could say, indecision, miscommunication, and the strategic direction hasn't hit to the heart of this problem. And the second point is raising an independent commission is going to be a very tough job. It took over a decade to raise WADA, which has been and has had a good track record of writing the rules and oversighting.
That's the World Anti-Doping Agency.
The independent commission. Absolutely. And with this, at the moment, there is going to be more and more cases come out. While the IAAF are actually policing, testing and sanctioning, it cannot ever get to the bottom of this. He has a tough job of convincing governments who run anti-doping bodies. He has a tough job of convincing the sporting community and the federations. So I think he has a good plan, but he will need an incredible amount of assistance to create what took over 10 years to create the World Anti-Doping Authority through the WADA rules. So I'll wait and have to see what's going to happen next.
Travis Waldron, do you think it was right that he was chosen over Sergei Bubka? I mean, it was very clear from Bubka's point of view what he was going to do to clean up the sport, but Coe hasn't really set out his stall yet, has he, other than saying there's going to be zero tolerance?
That's correct. You know, I think it doesn't really, in terms of who was right to choose, I don't know that it matters. You know, an independent commission is nice and a different president is nice, but some of this has to start with the reality that the athletes are always going to be ahead of who's testing. And you have to somewhat acknowledge research and data that shows that testing isn't necessarily a panacea in terms of catching athletes and preventing drug use. There has to be some acknowledgement of that reality that as long as the incentive is there to cheat, there are going to be cheats, and we can't pretend to be shocked at this. Now, maybe we can do things to limit it. We can try testing. We can kind of combat it with different ideas. But you know, at some point you have to stop and step back and say, what creative ways do we have to go to do this, because what we're doing right now isn't working. And I'm not necessarily sure that just an independent commission is going to change that.
An incentive is an interesting word that you use, because I'm sure that must be what drives the athletes to do this, the fame, the glory, the money. For many, I'm sure in places like Kenya and Russia, which have high doping statistics, they want to get out of their poverty. They want to be famous.
Of course, the incentive is huge. Whether you're talking about money, whether you're talking about fame and glory or getting out, however it is, you know, the chance that if you can take a drug that's going to help you win, a lot of athletes are going to do that, and that's a reality that, again, you kind of have to start this discussion by acknowledging.
John Goodbody, while we're talking about drugs and how widely they're being abused, tell us about what's happening at the moment as far as drugs are concerned. How come athletes are always able to stay one step ahead? Is it that easy to concoct something new and more creative?
It is, yes, to a certain extent, but quite often the athletes have to be advised in the ways that they might get round the tests by doctors, by scientists, and often by their coaches. For instance, to give you an example, I mean, one of the best known ways is the reinfusion of your own blood into your own body what is known as blood doping. What this involves is that a pint of your blood is taken out of your body sometime before your actual competition and then is re-infused back into your body just before the event, so that you can then have the ability to run for or swim or cycle for a lot longer than you would do ordinarily. Now, it is very difficult to test for this unless you have what is now coming in, which is the passports, the doping passports, which were being introduced into cycling and now into track and field athletics, and will become much more widespread across a whole range of sports in the years to come. And that will be able to monitor much more closely the whole time exactly the levels, the ordinary levels of people's blood, and the chemical makeup and biological makeup of those individuals. It's very important, these biological passports, and it's something that I think is long overdue in athletics. Was introduced now 4 or 5 years ago, but as the problem always with it is that you have to do a longitudinal study of the individual before you are able to judge whether the rise, for instance, in the hemoglobin level is because of the individual having been training at altitude, or possibly is pregnant, or a variety of different reasons. And that is why these passports are so important.
Do you agree with that, Travis? You say that it's going to take a lot more than an independent drugging body. Do these passports play an effective role? Because I know that Sebastian Coe is saying that in future championships there are going to be fewer tests because of the success of these passports. Do you agree?
I think so. I don't pretend to have a prescription for how to fix this. I think it just has to start. Excuse me. It has to start with some acknowledgement that the tests are always going to be behind the athletes. The technology for the testing, the amount of money going into testing is always going to be behind the amount of technology and the amount of money going into trying to beat the tests. And you can't test for something until you know it's out there, which gives the athletes an inherent advantage. And so I think you have to find creative ways that you can couple with an independent commission, that you can couple with testing to try and to fix this, because testing alone or just switching it to changing who's testing isn't going to be enough. And I think it's a tough reality to acknowledge, but it's one that has to be considered.
Stuart, you wanted to jump in?
Yes, I do actually. I agree and disagree with my fellow panel members. There was a recent report that has leaked out both through the Sunday Times and in Germany about the Russians cheating. Now, they were ahead of the curve. Those people were actually suppressed from actually releasing their data. Now, I have it from a reliable source that the IAAF did know about that in 2013, about those. And those researchers who were on the curveball of actually finding these cheats were actually not able to publish. Now, there's the point. It's about the governance and about the ability of the IAAF. If a group of researchers did find some anomalies and had known for a while, the IAAF did know about it. The problem we have is that the IAAF are responsible for testing and sanctioning, and you can't do that. It will not live. You can't have two bodies, the executive and the legislative, sitting within the same thing. There is no incentive for the IAAF to strike people off and ban them unless they find a one thing that they cannot hold back to the press. So the independent commission has to have an independent sanctioning board along with the testing. And I would ask, what about the funding? Who's going to fund this? You know, for instance, the World Anti-Doping Authority is funded 50% by the IOC. They have a vested interest. There's another conflict of interest. So the framework for international cooperation on this independent commission is crucial. Who and what are these people, and how can they stay an independent and neutral platform? I mean, in Sebastian Coe's world, he, in his future role, what he will need is to be able to have an independent commission come to him and say, this athlete tested positive, this is our recommendation for the sanction. He can't do all that by himself inside. It's like inbreeding inside sport.
John, I
And
wonder
that's where
what
we
you have
come
to say
problems
about
with-
those
well,
comments. I mean, your paper, the Sunday Times, was behind the revelations we've seen at Drip Feed over the last 3 weeks or so about how widespread this doping is and the fact that the IAAF has been accused of covering it up. Sebastian Coe's response was that this is a war on my sport. Why is he not addressing the allegations, rather turning it against the journalists?
I think the reason that he did that was for sporting political reasons, namely that he was at that time campaigning to become president of the IAAF. And if you look at the voting figures, he only had to lose 15 of the votes to Sergei Bubka for Bubka to get elected instead of him. And so I think his words there should be recognised as what they were, which is part of his campaign to become president of the IAAF. As far as the work that my colleagues on the Sunday Times did, what they showed was some very highly suspicious figures for a large number of competitors, some of which clearly were as a result of some sort of manipulation in their bodies through blood doping or through the taking of erythropoietin, EPO, some of which may have occurred through other reasons. And I know of one very famous British athlete who had an adverse reading, but who is absolutely adamant that the reading that that person had was a result of altitude training and not of having taken
so what do you make then
sort
of the timing and the revelations by Sunday Times, and do you think there's going to be more?
I wouldn't like to say what they will do. I would think there will certainly be further revelations in the weeks to come, but the nature of those I don't know.
Stuart, these athletes who've been caught, and there have been so many of them, as we know from the Sunday Times and latest exposés, do they deserve a second chance?
Well, that's where the purport of the sanctioning body versus the crime, and that's what the difficult part the IAAF have had over the many years, is what did they get caught, what was the event they're in, what was the, what did they get out of it, and the thing. So I actually think that there has to be a look back into the past to be able to understand what has gone wrong on the testing, the governance, and the sanctioning part, because there seems to be a disparate sort of sanctioning done by the IAAF on some athletes and not on others. So I think what we'll find is, from that report that was being suppressed, that you'll find that a lot of other people had looked at that report independently. Some have agreed and some have disagreed, but you'll find in the main that that report will actually open up more questions to be asked, because who did know in the world of sport about that?
Travis, I just wonder what it must be like to be a top athlete at the moment. They must feel that they too are under suspicion. It must be really hard to perform.
Right, and I think that goes to the inherent unfairness of all of this is, you know, the reason that we spend so much time and so much money fighting doping is because it's not fair to the athletes who aren't, and it's not fair to the people who want a clean sport. And the challenge is how to do that best. And I think the IAAF is going through that right now, the same way the IOC has, the same way cycling has, and the same way sports here and around the world have. It's a hard question to answer, and you know, but that you pointed out, the athletes who are doing it the right way is the reason you keep trying to answer it. And you know, hopefully Sebastian Coe and the IAAF will be able to figure it out some way and take some creative measure to do it right.
John, Sebastian Coe, obviously, other than reaching out to other effective doping bodies, he needs to reach out to spectators. He needs to prove to them that it's going to be okay.
Absolutely, because you know, it's the trust that is important. So that, for instance, with the World Championships beginning this weekend in Beijing, the people who are watching not only in the stadium but around the world on television recognise that what they see is honest sport, and that is, for instance, why there's been such a question mark this weekend over the 100 metres, where on the one hand you've got Usain Bolt, who has, you know, the twice Olympic champion, sprinting champion, against Justin Gatlin, who has twice been suspended for illicit practices. And it is very important for the sport in many ways that Bolt is seen to win this weekend, and at the moment Gatlin is the clear favourite on times done this year. But on a general point, you're absolutely correct. Just as in a football match you want to know that the goalkeeper hasn't been suborned with a huge amount of money in order to let in a goal, and that is exactly the same principle.
Right, so all eyes on Beijing, as you say, Stuart, but should audiences possibly get involved, spectators get involved, as well as sponsors? Do they have a role in stamping this out? I think you were indicating a little earlier that possibly athletes need to start turning on their co-athletes if they find out that they are indeed doping.
Absolutely. I think at this stage, you know, look at the FIFA, in paralleling with FIFA at the moment, is that we have the sponsors now stepping in. You know, Coca-Cola, McDonald's, Visa, Gazprom, they're demanding reform, and it's a similar principles that are happening. Is we're talking about the economics of sport. Sport is a big business. The values of sport have a long time gone, in which we're now looking for measures in that to assist the athlete be able to be on an even playing field. I think at this stage we've had government that's worked in its independent doping authorities in each country. We have an idea for an independent commission. We've had the World Anti-Doping Authority that was set up, which was only an oversight and make rules. That we have to look at the whole range of the governance and the whole supply chain of what's happening in the world of sport to be able to understand how we're going to start to keep this clean. Who's going to fund it, who's going to oversight it, and who's going to test it. So I think what we have is, I don't believe that in the next 3 weeks there'll be a framework that they'll be able to sit down and do. It's going to take a long time to reach any sort of principal aim to make the spectators believe that it is true. But by then, the media broadcast rights, the sponsors, a whole range of people will benefit from that. I think sport is in a crisis, but they don't know how to do it. And I don't know that they know, the sponsors know, or even the government authorities that enforce this. So I think we have to start from scratch on this whole thing.
Crisis indeed. Thank you very much for your thoughts, all three of you. Stuart Page, John Goodbody and Travis Waldron. And thank you as always for watching this episode of Inside Story. If you have any comments about today's show, please get in touch by going to our program page at aljazeera.com, or post your comments on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or you can tweet us at AJ Inside Story. From me, Jane Dutton, and the rest of the team, goodbye and thanks for watching.